In Half-Life 2, the Combine occupy the Earth. Having won the 7 Hours War after the events of Half-Life 1, they now oppress the remaining humans, shuffling them between the last safe urban centers while feeding them water tainted with memory-suppressing drugs. And those are just the lucky ones. You could be a Combine soldier.
Remember, no citizens.
With much of your meat, along with your eyes, replaced with glorious chrome cybernetics, with a side dish of memory implant brainwashing. Or worse yet, you could end up as a loathsome stalker, lurching through the many levels of the Citadel, as a lobotomized shell of who you once were. Now, like most people, you're probably thinking that the Combine are pretty evil. But what if I told you that the Combine saved humanity from something worse? Something much, much worse. 9/11. Last week, I made a clip of a little bit I did on the Combine stopping 9/11. Now, I made the mistake of thinking that the Combine invaded after the resonance cascade that occurred in Half-Life 1 in the mid-90s. And many people in the comments were eager to correct me. But I noticed something. Not all the comments agreed on exactly when the resonance cascade and resulting invasion occurred. Some place it before 9/11, while others place it afterwards. So today, we're going to take a look at all the evidence out there about the Half-Life timeline to finally answer the question: did the Combine stop 9/11? First off, let's establish some context. Now, technically speaking, there's no official year given for when the resonance cascade and subsequent Combine invasion occurred, with the year being indicated as 2000 and X, as indicated by certain documents in Half-Life, namely Gordon Freeman's offer of employment, which is dated as May 5th, 2000 and X. So that immediately narrows it down to between 2000 and 2009. Reddit user Ninefeld, in a post summarizing the Half-Life timeline, brings up a good point that it's likely that Gordon would have taken some time to move to Black Mesa in the USA. This is considering he was completing his PhD in Innsbruck, Austria, at the time he received his offer of employment. This user gave a timeline of around 10 days for Gordon to have made the move, starting his job at Black Mesa on May 15th. Now, I personally think that that's a bit short for an intercontinental move, but for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that this short time frame is the least amount of time it would take before Gordon started at Black Mesa. Now, it's implied that while Gordon Freeman didn't work at Black Mesa that long, implied by a line from Dr. Breen in Half-Life 2,
Gordon Freeman is a theoretical physicist who had hardly earned the distinction of his PhD at the time of the Black Mesa incident.
he would have had to work there for a few weeks or months to have developed friendly relationships with his scientist colleagues, Eli and Kleiner, as well as Barney, the security guard. This means that the resonance cascade likely didn't occur earlier than September 2000X, or at least didn't occur before May 15th, if we assume that Gordon really didn't work that long at Black Mesa. Now, we can narrow the timeline down even further. In Half-Life Alyx, you come across some keycards. Now, these keycards have expiry dates listed on them, with one of them expiring on December 5th, 2001. Now, these keycards are still usable in Half-Life Alyx, meaning that whatever authority it was that would have disabled these keycards after their expiration date either no longer existed or was otherwise disrupted. Let's make the reasonable assumption that this disruption was the portal storms that occurred across the Earth in the wake of the events of Half-Life 1 and subsequent invasion by the Combine. So this dates the global disruptions after the resonance cascade as having occurred no later than December 5th, 2001. Building off that December date, there's another piece of evidence in Half-Life Alyx that points towards a more specific timeline for the resonance cascade and its consequences. A newspaper reporting on Earth's surrender to the Combine. Now, in the top left, you can see that the number of years that the paper was in publication was listed, along with the issue number. Now, for you Zoomers who've never seen a newspaper before, the issue number indicates how many times the newspaper has been published in a year. Since this is breaking news being reported, it would be fair to assume that the newspaper we see here, The Times, is a newspaper that is published daily rather than weekly or monthly. That would mean that this being issue 3, it would be from the 3rd day of the year, so January 3rd. It would also be fair to assume that this is reporting on the previous day's news, dating Earth's surrender to the Combine as January 2nd, 2000 and X. Since we have previously determined that the resonance cascade could have occurred no later than December 5th, 2001, and we know that it was only a short time after the resonance cascade that the Combine invaded Earth, in theory, this newspaper could have been published on January 3rd, 2002. But it's also possible that it was published on January 3rd, 2001, as this would also fall after the start of Gordon's employment at Black Mesa. However, based on another newspaper article found in Half-Life Alyx, it is more plausible that the correct date here is January 3rd, 2001. Now, in this second article, the author talks about the worldwide closure of stock markets and how it is a stark difference to the soaring stock markets in the weeks prior. Now, if we assume that the global stock markets in Half-Life followed the real-life stock markets, then we can look at the dot-com bubble to try to time when these soaring stock markets would have been. Now, for those unaware, the dot-com bubble was a huge run-up in the stock market, predicated on investment mania in internet companies, starting in 1995, and then followed by sudden panic selling starting in the year 2000. Now, the dot-com bubble technically burst in April 2000, with the Nasdaq having lost 34.2% of its value after having peaked in March of 2000. But the stock market did rally and do better, if only briefly, a few times on the way down throughout the year. One of these rallies being late in 2000 and running into very early 2001. This would align perfectly with one of our previously theorized dates for the 7 Hours War, January 2nd, 2001. However, using this as evidence does require assuming that there would be similar stock market conditions in a world where Black Mesa and Aperture Science exist in the tech sector. It's not entirely unlikely though, as early internet hype could have still easily occurred separately from Black Mesa and Aperture, paving the way for the dot-com bubble to also exist in the Half-Life universe. Now so far, this is all a pretty big assumption regarding the timeline, if not for some evidence from Half-Life Opposing Force that further supports the likely date of the 7 Hours War being January 2nd, 2001. In the manual that comes with the Half-Life Blue Shift Complete Expansion Set, there is a subsection for Half-Life Opposing Force, which is presented as a soldier's handbook. The publishing date of the handbook is listed as January 2000, with some notes written by Adrian Shepard dated during March, and it would be fair to date these entries as March 2000, the same year the manual was published. The final entry on March 15th indicates that Shepard and his unit were told to be ready in case it happens tomorrow, with it heavily being implied to be the Black Mesa incident, which they were training for. This means that it's likely that the resonance cascade did not occur too terribly long after this note was written. So now we've narrowed down the timeline to somewhere between March 16th, 2000 and January 2nd, 2001. Now, technically we could stop here. I mean, I've already kind of shown that the resonance cascade likely took place before 9/11, but we're going to keep going down this rabbit hole. Why? Because I want to style on the haters that were telling me that I was wrong. That's why. Now, based on the newspaper articles in Half-Life Alyx, it also seems like the Combine invasion of Earth occurred amidst the confusion of the portal storms caused by the resonance cascade. Since it implies that humanity was still struggling to respond to portal storms and had only barely begun to study them, the time between the resonance cascade and the Combine invasion was likely only a few days to weeks. If we assume, based on evidence thus far, that the 7 Hours War occurred on January 2nd, 2000, and the resonance cascade occurred sometime between March 16th, 2000 and January 2nd, 2000, we can even narrow down the plausible date range further. Now we can do this using two bits of evidence from the original Half-Life. The first being a calendar prop that can be found in Half-Life, Half-Life Blue Shift, and Half-Life Opposing Force in the Office Complex section of the Black Mesa map. The calendar being for the month of December. Now, our second clue narrowing down the date is the moon, visible in the sky in Half-Life in the chapter On a Rail. Now, we have already established, given a few assumptions, that it is likely the 7 Hours War occurred on January 2nd, which, given this calendar in Black Mesa, would place the resonance cascade sometime around December 2000. Building on this, we can look at the moon in this particular chapter of Half-Life and then cross-reference it with the lunar cycles of December 2000. This places the current date in Half-Life to around December 15th or December 16th of the year 2000. It's a bit hard to tell considering the moon is a bit low res here, but that's roughly the phase it looks like. Now, I must mention, I also did notice some sources asserting that the Black Mesa incident occurred on May 16th. This would be because of some particular timelines detailed in the lesser-known PS2 port of Half-Life. In the manual, a training schedule places Gordon Freeman doing his HEV training course in Half-Life on May 16th. This would mean that the tutorial level of Half-Life is confirmed to have occurred on May 16th if we trust this document. However, this is considered to have been possibly retconned, on account of Half-Life 2 making numerous references to Gordon's relationships and camaraderie with his former colleagues like Barney, Kleiner, and Eli at Black Mesa, that could not have possibly developed if he had only worked there a day or a handful of days. So for this reason, it is not as likely that May 16th was the date that the resonance cascade occurred on, and I believe my previous mentioned date of December 15th or 16th, 2000 is the more likely date that the resonance cascade occurred on. Now, this isn't to say that my hypothesis of the Combine having prevented 9/11 here is airtight. There's actually some information out there that suggests that I might be wrong. First and foremost being the notes of the former lead writer for the Half-Life series, Mark Laidlaw himself. In the book, Half-Life 2, Raising the Bar, there are some brainstorming notes included from Laidlaw that lay out a particular date for the Black Mesa incident, March 31st, 2003, at exactly 4:33 p.m. Now you're probably thinking, well, that was the lead writer for the series' own words. He's basically the god of this world, and he just told me I'm wrong. But that's not quite true. You see, these are brainstorming notes, so though this date was likely put forth as a possible date for the resonance cascade, there is no evidence out there to suggest that this was the definitive, final date that Valve went with. Considering the earlier evidence we've seen that hint at when the resonance cascade might have occurred, like dates listed in the Half-Life manuals, none of it points towards 2003. So I think it would be fair to say that we can disregard the date in Mark Laidlaw's notes. Plus, it should be noted that it's been some time since Mark Laidlaw parted ways with Valve. He still does have an amicable relationship with them, and Valve has mentioned consulting Laidlaw at times for story-related matters, but ultimately, he is no longer the literary god of the Half-Life universe. So it's entirely possible that Valve has diverged from his idea of when the resonance cascade would have occurred since his departure. There's also that damn calendar from Half-Life. Now I know I previously used it to date the resonance cascade in December of 2000, but there's a problem with doing that. The calendar has December 8th and 15th on a Sunday, which would place it in December of 2002. Now, I don't think that this means that the resonance cascade occurred in 2002, as we previously saw information from other Half-Life games that would make this unlikely. In this case, that is namely the expiration dates on the keycards in Half-Life Alyx, making it so that it is unlikely that the 7 Hours War occurred later than December 5th, 2001. There's also the matter of Adrian Shepard's notes in Half-Life Opposing Force, mentioning that the mission he was being prepared for might happen tomorrow, on March 15th, 2000, which suggests that the Resonance Cascade did not occur too long after this date. Now, this all might have just been an oversight by Valve, or it could be that at the time of Half-Life's original release, the timeline for the Resonance Cascade was a bit different than what it is now that later games in the series have fleshed out the timeline a little bit. Or, more realistically, this calendar could have just been a prop that was hastily made with no real consideration for its impact on the timeline, because, honestly, what kind of a person is going to obsessively overanalyze a random calendar in the background of a video game level? It's me. I'm that guy. In the end, after looking at all the evidence on the table, I choose to believe. I choose to believe that the Combine prevented 9/11. Looking at our evidence-based timeline, they invaded before September 11th, 2001, in all likelihood. Who knows? Maybe that's the entire reason they invaded Earth, as their justification for conquering humanity is shrouded in mystery in Half-Life's lore. They killed billions to save thousands. That's the work of a true hero, if I've ever seen one.